Hi, I'm Dave Long. If you have questions at any point, by all means, feel free. 25 minutes, Linda?
About,
Okay.
yeah. And then questions, so get your questions ready.
Okay. I apologize in advance. There's at least 6 threads that I thought about as I was walking up the hill that I'm not going to get to. And so if you're thinking, this or that or the other thing didn't make it in, I tried to limit things. Economics is about scarcity. And thank you for coming. You are embracing the values of Western civilization and demonstrating Western civilization. You took a chance coming here this morning. I mean, who knows what this guy's going to say. My daughter would have had all kinds of advice for you about coming to see me. You are engaged in the process of being a lifelong learner, which is, of course, one of the key things we want to instill in our young people at Brookfield Academy. So I will try to get through, we'll get through as much of this as I can, and the 3 threads of my talk: the moral perspective about why to learn Western Civ, why to teach Western Civ, why it's important for young people to learn the lessons of Western civilization, the economic perspective, and practical perspective. I'm a very practical, at least I like to think I'm a practical and pragmatic person, so we can start with, well, I mean, there's a lot of criticism and controversy about Western civilization and general aura of critique, and I think many of us are old enough to remember the Doomsday Clock and the Bureau of Atomic Scientists and all the rest of that stuff, and I looked it up the other day because I remembered it from back when I used to teach a lot about the Cold War, and I discovered it's 100 seconds to midnight, so if you feel a little palpitation now and again, maybe that's it. We are bombarded with messages about, the end is nigh, and I just had a conversation with my students about the history of the apocalypse, and they were able to name at least 3 or 4 different apocalypses. Both of these books, the left is a Canadian piece, and the right, Jared Diamond, is really pretty well known. He's written a couple of bestsellers. He's actually more of a cultural anthropologist type. I used a little bit of his work at the start of the school year. And so the notion about Western civilization, and quote by Gandhi, when asked, what do you think of it, he says, I think it'd be a good idea. So this idea of Western civilization, therefore, is subject to some criticism. And I'm sorry, when I translated it over from Google Slides, my headings washed out for some reason.
Oh, sorry about that.
No worries.
Okay.
And so the critique of Western civilization, or the general sort of cultural conversation, there is, at least in some circles, I think, some reticence or some whataboutism when it comes to Western civilization. So a brief sort of overview about what Western civilization, the culture, or the values of Western civilization would include. Certainly individualism is at the core of it. And for those of you who remember the BA 5 stars, individualism and individuality, of course, is part of that, and that was intentionality. But notions of equality, notions of tolerance, notions of being inclusive. And so I'll thread these through the talks. I'll get to democracy on the next slide or so. Property rights, tolerance, and religious diversity. So this is a broad sketch about core values of Western civilization, and on a later slide I'll have a slightly different take or slightly different set of ideas on that. And then, of course, freedom of inquiry, the idea of exploring ideas. So when we think about Western civilization, why do we teach Western civilization? The core ideas of it, which is not to be confused with what, history is, of course, the study of the past, how these things appear in the past. So here's a quote from Winston Churchill. And when we think about Western civilization, one of the things we ask, one of the things I talk to my students about is progress. And right now, Charlemagne just passed, and I'll ask the audience, what happened in Europe after Charlemagne passed? Oh, I gotta get my participation scores. All right, Charlemagne's described as the founder of Europe. He dies of old age, 62 or 63, I think it was. What happened to... War? Oh, that's a fair guess. always the same guess. So the tradition among the Franks was to divide the kingdom among the sons. So divided among several sons as a consequence of fragments, and as a consequence after that, you get the Viking invasions, you get the Magyars, you get the Muslims at different times and all the rest, and it falls apart. So Winston Churchill here is speaking, so, and then you have this lack of progress, sorry, and we'll get into feudalism, so my lessons today, tomorrow. Moving forward, feudalism is a response to that situation. So Winston Churchill's quote about democracy that says, yes, democracy has its flaws. However, you have to think about it in context, which is what are the alternatives? And in Winston Churchill's mind, the alternatives are pretty terrible, which I will sadly detail in some great detail moving forward. And that takes us to two quotes, Murray Rothbard and C.S. Lewis, and the questions of virtue. So when we think about the moral perspective of Western civilization, it embraces asking questions about virtue and asking questions about integrity. And later in the slide, I'll have a few words to say, if I get there, about how that has impacted the history of China and understanding the world today. But the notion, and that takes us to my kids, because I feel it's kind of my mission to embarrass my kids, and they would tell you I'm fantastically successful at it. And when I think about teaching, I think about education, one of the things that has impacted me, I started teaching 26 years ago. My kids are now teenagers, so I was 10 years into teaching before my kids came along. And one of the things little people do is, if you pay attention, they constantly teach us. And they would constantly ask the question, why? And suggesting, the nature of what people are like, and that we want to explore, we want to understand, we want to construct, make sense of the world. And of course, the worst possible answer of a parent, which I can't say I've never said, is because I've said so. So that notion is closing the door on curiosity, closing the door. Now maybe the kid's trying to push your buttons, and not that children ever do that, right? This picture is from their first day of school, and I forget which, that's probably first grade and third grade or something like that, which takes us to the power of exploration. So here my kids are at the museum, and you can see my daughter has discovered she does not like giant slimy fish, and my son has discovered that of course he has, or maybe he's just enjoying the state of distress of his sister. Which takes us to human purpose. Bloom's taxonomy is a way to express levels of critical thinking. So one of the things I talk to my freshmen about is sort of what, that first day in high school, where are we going, what is this about? One way to, the lower level skills, which are required to learn any new skills, you need to learn some vocabulary, for example, or specific facts. And then moving up the chain, higher levels of sophistication, of thinking, of reasoning, evaluation, and synthesis. Synthesis is putting things together, and then of course creation, take what you know and make something of it. So when we think about that, and we think about ancient societies and Western civilization, as I move away from the educational psychology here a little bit, we think about the Greeks. So after a couple of weeks of sort of setting, 2 or 3 weeks of setting the stage of the world, we get to the Greeks. And what are the Greeks about? And that answer is individualism. And Homer emerges, the Iliad and the Odyssey emerge, and those are stories about the individual and immortal stories. And so what is it to live as a Greek? To live as a Greek, it is to serve, it is to create. And yeah, they did a whole lot of battling. I thought about throwing the phalanx in and all the rest of that. But the Greeks grappled with the question that stays with us today. How do you balance the rights of the individual with the needs of the community? And the Greeks, because of their unique Mediterranean climate, had the outdoor lifestyle, had the customs of gathering in the public squares and debating the issues of the day and being informed citizens, had lessons to teach us about how a society can successfully grapple with that. And that takes us to another famous quote. I'll defend your right to say that which I don't like to the death, attributed to Evelyn Beatrice Hall. So, the trial of Socrates, of course, accusations of being a public gadfly, saying that which is undesirable, drinking the hemlock and all of the rest, emerges as one of those lessons in history, one of those moments in history to think about. Which takes us to today. Why learn Western civilization? These, the lessons of Western civ stay with us. So this is a piece about generational threat to free speech, and it's talking about a new clash, the 20th century being a clash between liberal and social economics, and this being a clash between, what did they describe it, cultural socialism and cultural liberalism. And students need to understand what small L liberalism, not big L liberalism, small L, big L liberalism, Bill Clinton and all that kind of stuff, as opposed to small L liberalism, Adam Smith, which of course is contingent or coherent with our freedom philosophy. So if you wanted one slide about why we need to teach Western civilization, it might be this one. PC is political correctness. And what this shows is younger people being more in favor of political correctness, which is a stifling of free speech, a stifling of public expression, a stifling of public debate, which of course is what has set us on the trajectory of progress for humanity over the last couple of decades. And so along with that comes the concept of ethical monotheism, which we get from the Hebrews. So that goes to the way back. And also, of course, the New Testament and the Old Testament. So the work of Jesus, for example, in the New Testament and the Sermon on the Mount, blessed are the poor, and the rest of those phrases. And the covenant, of course, is the promise of the special relationship between God and the Hebrews. And so when we think about the origins of concepts like human rights, I mean, where is the idea of human rights from? It is not a monopoly in Western civilization to have the idea of treating others as we would like to be treated, but learning history gives us the window to see where this comes from and why it is important. So the story of the Hebrews is an amazing story, and that of the covenant, dating from the time of Abraham back, so that story, is that 3,500 years now, I think? Yeah, I figure if it's 1250 or 1500 BC, one or the other. So where does the idea of speaking truth to power come from? So we want our children to grow up and be assertive and take an active role in the world, and be able to say when they believe something is wrong or when they believe something. And this is something that we need to be able to model for them in a free society. And that idea comes back here to the Hebrews way back in the day. And so when we think about other moral connotations and connections about learning Western civilization, this, of course, all right class, what's that a picture of? There we go. So that is the Sistine Chapel, of course, the work of many years, one of the great artistic expressions. And I thought about art and how to incorporate art into this presentation, and it's just one of those areas that I wish I knew more about. And then, of course, here we have Notre Dame, which is in the process of being repaired, of course. And these are expressions of what the human spirit can do, and the idea of having that freedom to express, to pursue that which you believe in. And cathedrals are an expression of faith, and communities taking decades contributing together to build these, for example. Which takes us to the economic perspective, which is going to be more in my comfort wheelhouse. So the fundamental economic condition is unlimited wants in the face of limited resources. That is the fundamental economic conditions. And the 20th century saw the debate of how to answer this question. Should the answer be organized by a central authority? And Lenin and Stalin in the 20s and the 30s with the command economy were one model for that. You could throw in the New Deal if you, in the American context, or the Nazis and their 4-year plans, versus the bottom-up, individually organized society. So that takes us to the work of Hayek, who won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 1974. And when we think about, Hayek had a lot to say about complexity. And what's faded out there is something called the knowledge problem. And there's 3 problems. Hayek pointed out 3 problems, 3 general areas of challenge with information. One is that information is mutable, it changes. So any piece of information, any data point you have over time is subject to change. Information is expensive to get. I asked my juniors yesterday about how is the college search an example of the knowledge problem. And they are spending an hour a week, I think it is, in college class. They have to research. Actually, many of you know the answer. How many colleges are kids supposed to come up with to look at? 30. So 30 colleges, and then of course they'll be writing essays, doing applications, and all the rest of that. And therefore, of course, is both diffuse, because there's thousands of different colleges, and as a consequence, information about those colleges is quite widespread. So in dealing with that problem, we of course have Mr. Spaeth and Ms. Gabriel to help guide the kids through, but the fact that they need Mr. Gabriel, or Ms. Gabriel and Mr. Spaeth to guide in that process is in fact connected to the knowledge problem. So as an economist, I think about why should kids learn Western civilization? Well, the fact of the matter is the problems of the world are, the problems to be solved are increasing in complexity. They're not getting simpler. So I was reading a piece this morning. Apparently Lamborghini has invented or is deploying a new navigation software for those of us who can afford $2 million cars. And it expresses that self-driving cars are kind of like a rocket car, right? They just keep getting farther away into the future, and that's because they're really complicated problems. And the same is true of artificial intelligence, the development and use of artificial intelligence and quantum computers, for example, the problem of world poverty, problems of population, the list could go on. So as a society, we need to prioritize how to deal with these problems and think about how best to deal with them. And Hayek argues convincingly that the answer has to do with the bottom-up model. Of course, this gentleman, famous for 1,000 tries to invent the light bulb. He didn't work by himself, but at best a very small team. So he was, of course, America's arguably most famous inventor. And he didn't invent the light bulb, but he did invent, he and his team, the bamboo filament that would last for $1,200. And so he is considered one of America's great geniuses. And then one of the things I want to encourage my children and my students to be is skeptics and to be asking questions. So there's a kind of literature about the experts. And be skeptical of the experts. And that takes us, of course, to Albert Einstein, who you may or may not be aware, and this is a Civ 2 person, of course, person of the 20th century. So when Time magazine gave some thought to who the most important person of the 20th century was, Albert Einstein, who of course fled Nazi Germany in 1932 because of religious persecution. And the separate piece, turns out Einstein made mistakes. And I saw one piece about 3 of Einstein's big mistakes and another about 5 of Einstein's big mistakes. And to Einstein's defense, he operated more or less before computers, more or less before many, if not any, of the technologies that would actually prove his theories. If I recall correctly, they used satellites to prove relativity, and I want to say that was in the 70s when they finally put that together. So he was, that was decades after his scene. And so one great Einstein quote, "Ego is won over knowledge." And so here we associate Einstein as being justifiably, I think, one of the great minds of all times. And he understood that pursuing knowledge is a humbling task because it raises questions, which takes us back to the kids and the questions why. That is the start of a road. That is part of a process. So one of my favorite Einstein quotes, "You can't solve a problem from the level of consciousness that created it," which is truly profound. Because if you had the level of consciousness that required to solve the problem, you wouldn't have the problem in the first place. So Einstein is teaching us about that hierarchy of intellectual skills and intellectual reasoning, and the idea that mental maturity and mental growth and mental exploration, therefore, is very important, which is a core value of Western civilization. And so here we have a piece of criticism about stock pickers. And I guess I could have dug up predictions about the stock market from December 31st when all of the experts come out. And of course, it's been quite an exciting January for the stock market, would be one way to put it. This is a separate piece about experts, and basically what it argues is that experts not only are often incorrect, but rarely are actually held accountable for not being correct. And therefore, this piece suggests that experts actually oftentimes don't get better. And so when we think about why do we need to develop our own knowledge, why do we need to develop our own curiosity, looking to others for solutions to our problems is potentially problematic. Which takes us to why experts are often wrong. All right, I'll ask the audience here. Why are experts often wrong?
The knowledge is very small. The knowledge base is narrow.
Narrow knowledge base? Sure.
Built-in biases.
Bias. So that we all carry bias with us. It's inescapable. We need to recognize our bias. Other ideas?
It's hard to admit you're wrong when
Ah, yes. Yes. The whole wrong thing. Yeah, that's one thing I learned early in teaching is if I made a mistake or didn't know something, just tell the kids, because the kids are smart. Yeah, just tell them, I don't know, and if it's appropriate, look it up and get back to them. So certainly bias, certainly overconfidence, because after all, we got that credential, for example. Information, of course, how much information do you have? The idea that you have a complete picture is highly dubious. What kind of feedback are we getting? And feedback, of course, is one of the important things. The scientific process, for example, is all about testing your hypothesis and adjusting as needed. Which takes us to a separate book about the wisdom of crowds. So Hayek is offering a vision, a bottom-up vision of how to organize society based on freedom of expression and individualism. This is a 2006 best-selling work. It's available in PDF online if you are so inclined to take a look at it. And Socrates talks about when crowds work best. So this is the idea about when you are dealing with a problem. What's the best way? Under what conditions do crowds successfully work with that? And one answer is, of course, diversity. So we want diversity in a crowd. We want a crowd of people who are different life experiences, different backgrounds, for example. We are looking for a larger group. And so one example could be the jury system, where you are not relying on one person to make a decision. You are looking for a group of people. Herd behavior, of course, is contrary to the nature of the group. So that notion that we need a group of individuals working as a team, either formally or informally, and the notion of independence, the notion of being engaged in the problem. This is the notion that the group is diverse, could be geographically, could be in background. The idea is that there needs to be some kind of coordination mechanism. capitalism. And of course, we have markets and prices in the context of economics, for example, to do this. And the importance of the rules of the game and the structure of how you organize society, whether it's the tax code, which kind of gives me a little palpitation about that. And then, of course, the importance of trust. So how can we, as a society, engage in problem solving, given limited resources? And Surowiecki and Hayek basically give us this similar integrated answer, which is a society based on pluralism, small L liberalism, individualism, which is a direction to deal with these problems. And of course, the other answer is top-down. And the 20th century has lots to teach us about that. One of the expressions of this, I Pencil by Leonard Red, is a piece about the manufacture, distribution of pencils, which we take for granted as a rather innocuous object. But Red talks about how this is in fact a symphony, an unexpected result of people all over the world with all kinds of different skills and all kinds of different backgrounds, all kinds of different processes and materials being used to produce these things, which of course speaks to people acting on their own. There is no master plan. There is no master pencil plan. I hope this doesn't worry you. There is no National Pencil Committee. There is, now I'm remembering I think we're old enough to remember the Gorbachev and the Soviet Committee on Pantyhose. We didn't need that here in the West because we have emergent orders or groups or systems that evolve to deal with problems. So the notion of emergent order, which takes us to two interesting characters in the United States today, the notion of what we as individuals can do. And both these men, I saw Musk on Saturday Night Live, I think it was last year, and he announced that he had Asperger's there on national TV, and not that that was a surprise, because he had always, well, yeah, I mean, he was just the odd duck, right? I mean, that's not pejorative, it's just, there were the other kids, and then there was Elon, right? So, the fact that we have a society where you can be an outlier like that, where you can function in a society, where you can pursue your dreams, where you see a vision and move towards that vision. Now, his vision, both of these men have a similar vision, which is to go into space. And Bezos actually put that, I think, in his high school valedictorian speech, if I recall correctly. And Bezos is also famous or infamous for purchasing the Washington Post, which has the slogan of democracy dies in darkness. So Bezos either, I mean, the charitable interpretation might be he is a vociferous defender of the free press and the importance of a free press and liberal democracy, or he wants to influence the most important newspaper in Washington, D.C., where he needs lobbying influence. Look at it either way. So, similarly, we have Apple and their famous campaign, Think Different. We live in a society where you can come out and say, I am different, I want to do things differently. Years ago, the founders had a radical idea of Brookfield Academy, which was, we're going to start our own school. That is in response to a problem, is an emergent order, a small group of people, like-minded people got together, shared their talents, and made it happen. And that is part of the lesson. So there we have Amelia Earhart and a bunch of other people at the advertising department at Apple thought that we would find interesting or engaging to buy Apple products. And given that they've got a $3 trillion valuation a couple of weeks ago, it worked pretty well. This is practical economic elements of progress in Western civilization. They're practical but drab. So these are actually really important things Western civilization has given us that we take for granted. So we look to history not just for the bright shining moments of the Spartans at Thermopylae, which is rife with all kinds of irony I don't have time to go into now, but bankruptcy, it turns out, is a really big deal. Because what does bankruptcy allow us to do as a society?
Start
start over, to fail. The notion that failure is not a permanent end, and debt slavery was the solution in Solon's reforms back in ancient Greece changed debt slavery, for example, and then it later emerged in the 1500s and then forward from that. Double entry accounting, also the only class I took pass-fail in college. All the classes I took, one I took pass-fail, and that was accounting because, well, any accountants. I've got a joke somewhere about the difference between an economist and an accountant, and it has to do with personality. The corporation, of course, the Dutch being among the leaders, and so I teach my students, how can it be that Holland has this tremendous moment in the sun, given its very small size, its lack of population, its lack of natural resources, other than, of course, a tremendous harbor or harbors. And a lot of that has to do with mundane things like corporations. The insurance is a product of the Renaissance, but insurance, of course, it makes risk easier, and risk is, of course, a critical part of Western civilization. Exploration would be one way to look at that. And then in terms of economics, this is the Index of Economic Freedom of Singapore, which is 4th in the world in GDP per capita. So if we think about what economics has to teach us about Western civilization and liberal values, this is a global ranking. And I picked Singapore because the first couple weren't really, I mean, Monaco is not really a country. I can't take Luxembourg. Anybody from Luxembourg? I can't take you seriously as a country. I forget what third was. This is the metric of income per capita on the vertical axis versus the Index of Economic Freedom score. So this would be more free, and what you see is a correlation between freedom and wealth. So as an economist, if you want to make an economy work and bring prosperity to people, this is a separate version with score versus GDP per capita on a log scale. We see, again, a very clear connection between the two. And then finally, our practical perspective. All right, so practically, why learn Western civilization? So walking into a history course, what might students reasonably want to know? Well, why is the world the way it is? That seems like a pretty fundamental question to ask. What does history have to teach us, and what creates progress, among other things? This is, well, I apologize for the size, but this is Time Magazine's most important figures in history. Number 1 is Jesus, Napoleon. The only non-Western person on here is, of course, Muhammad, who has a role in Western civilization because of the Crusades, among other things, and various periods of scientific progress in and across the Middle East and Muslim Spain. So practically, what history should kids learn? Well, given that 1 through 11 are all major figures in Western civilization, that speaks to teaching Western civilization. I'm not necessarily, I see Shakespeare is there as number 4. So quite the varied list. This is a separate list from the University of Western Michigan. Genghis Khan is the first non-Westerner at 22, but Genghis Khan facilitated indirectly the transmission of technology from China to Europe, so in that sense, critical part of Western civ. Number 1, in case you can't read that, because you don't have 25 vision, is Gutenberg, inventor, of course, of, I shouldn't say inventor, developer of, so movable type printing press. So I didn't say invented, but developer. I think I've got a slide. And then down here, 43 is Mao Zedong. And you could toss around whether Lenin was a Westerner or not, but at the bottom line, when we're thinking about history and what we should learn in a history class, this is certainly illustrative. This is a book I walked by in the bookstore. It's a bestseller for, I don't know how much that's worth. But it turns out that China discovered America in 1421. And my reaction, of course I have muted over there, is really? And that is supposedly a 1763 map of the world. And I'll ask the people down in the front who can see it. I do this with my students at the start of the school year. What might stand out to you about this map of the world, which is actually pretty good? Yeah, California's that. What Chinese characters? So supposedly, I mean, this is from an Economist magazine article I read a couple of years ago. The position of some Chinese scholars is that this is conclusive proof that the Chinese not only circumnavigated the world, but I guess they had the whole thing down by 1418, which of course supports this. And by the way, Gavin Menzies is not a historian to the extent that that gives you any license to say history. So this is a brainstorm question. All right, 20 seconds with your neighbor. Major inventions you can name that came from China prior to the 20th century. So gunpowder, in terms of what the Chinese invented, the compass and the rough dates. Paper, I saw one piece where the most influential person in history was actually the man who invented paper. Because of the tremendous influence. Paper didn't spread to the West until much later. Printing press, movable type, and the point of this slide, fireworks we see across the clock, mechanical clock, silk, to the extent that silk is a major invention, iron smelting, bronze, the seed drill. So when we think about Gavin Menzies' thesis, the notion that the Chinese could have done this on the face of it is not preposterous. I mean, that's a pretty impressive body of technology, which does not include, by the way, waterproof, watertight compartments on ships, multiple masts, the navigation, I'm forgetting the name of the navigation wheel, the steering wheel on the ships. This is the Voyages of a Chinese explorer, Zheng He. And turns out that Zheng He, I mean, this is a real historical person, got as far as the coast of Africa, brought giraffes and the rest back to the port in China. And the comeuppance of this is that they stopped. So the Chinese voyages of exploration stopped with Zheng He. And they stopped for a number of different reasons. Of particular interest to us are a disinterest in foreigners and a sense of cultural superiority. In other words, feeling like foreigners had nothing worthy to trade or nothing worthy to teach. And then a disdain of wealth or profit. So the notion of going out and seeking the gold and the spices, which Columbus and the rest are associated to some extent with, is part of that. The consequences of this, this is the imperialists dividing China circa 1900. So China, because it was so remote from Europe, could cut itself off of the world, from the world, not to pursue progress, not to pursue engagement. But that bill came due with the tragic historical consequences. And the same trajectory is true of China, which literally banned foreigners visiting on pain of death. And
Talking about Japan, right?
yeah, Japan. I don't know if that was true of China or not, but the Japanese were. The word for foreigner was barbarian in Techie, if I recall correctly. And so the counterpoint to that, two books. Niall Ferguson is quite prolific. Has written quite a lot of stuff. He writes a comparative book about Western civilization and why Western civilization was a dominant theme in world history. Why was the West able to do this after the Chinese had so much a lead in another classicist, Victor Davis Hanson, wrote one about military history. Why does the West win these battles? And then he's got a bunch. He goes through, which is actually quite the interesting variety from Salamis to Midway. And the general themes between the two gentlemen aren't that different. So the notion of embracing knowledge, of being flexible, of being tolerant, property rights, interestingly, on both, but when it comes to motivation, property rights is highly motivating and highly effective, and a very effective aligned incentive. Hansen includes religious tolerance, for example. Ferguson would describe these as the 6 killer apps of Western civilization. So when we study Western civilization from this perspective, because these things had the implementation of these policies or these ideas had a big impact, and that takes us to Hayek's piece. He has chapter 2 in Road to Serfdom is called Utopia. And what Hayek has to tell us, if we go, what does history teach us about, okay, we're going to go with the top-down model, what does history teach us? And in a general statement, Hayek is writing in 1944, argues that not only do you not get utopia if you try for it, but the consequences will be unbelievable until it's fully exposed. And so one example of this is a depiction, a film depiction of the Wannsee Conference. All right, historians, what was the Wannsee Conference? Oh, Long's asking me questions. Give a signature, right?
The final solution.
Wannsee Conference?
The final solution.
This is the meeting where the Nazis, 20-ish leading Nazis, literally got together, suburb outside of Berlin, and Erich Heydrich, depicted here by Kenneth Branagh, literally decide and design the implementation of the final solution, which was, of course, the genocide of the Jews. This is Stanley Tucci playing Eichmann, who Heydrich is assassinated about 6 weeks later by Czech patriots, and that leaves Eichmann as the singular person most associated. And you might remember that the Israelis spent years tracking him after World War II, found him in Argentina, smuggled him back, and all of the rest of that. But the point of the Wannsee Conference was to create Hitler's Utopia, which was a Jew-free Europe, a Europe without diversity, a Europe without religious toleration. And a second example of 20th century, this is China and the Great Leap Forward. And these are Chinese propaganda pieces from the late 50s and the early 60s. I personally like the 500-pound cabbages, and the goal was to pass Britain in iron production. So I could have included, you might remember the backyard furnaces and all the rest of that preposterousness. So this creates a culture of lies and deceit, because to say things like a backyard furnace smelting pig iron is a really bad idea when we should be growing food so people don't starve, is of course highly unwelcome in a complete top-down society. And so this is world population change, and you can literally see the Great Leap Forward right there, with the largest singular starvation in the history of mankind. I did not include Stalin and the Ukrainian famine, although I could have. And of course, we have our warnings about utopia. Orwell, of course, 1984, and Animal Farm are both warnings about utopia, about trying to achieve a singular top-down vision like that. Orwell writing while Stalin was still alive, if I recall correctly, 1948. And that takes us to the story in China. Mao is followed by Deng Xiaoping, who, quite frankly, tries to fix the mess. And he does that in significant part by embracing free trade and exports and trading with the West. And one of the arguments for that is quite clear. The roughly 400 million people lifted out of poverty. So when we think about the practical aspects of Western civilization and choice and trade, that is the single greatest improvement of conditions for people pretty much ever. And that is, of course, the goddess democracy carried by the protesters in Tiananmen Square in 1989. So the hopes were, along with economic reform, would come political reform, following the Western model. And that, of course, is followed by the most famous single picture of the 20th century, which would be Who's that guy?
Tankman.
Tank Man. Tank Man is standing up. He is speaking voice to power. He is expressing values of Western civilization, individualism. He is speaking against the literal power of the state being deployed against peaceful protesters. So the story of Tank Man is a powerful indictment, and to this day, there is a mystery about what happened to Tank Man. It is not known. Did he was taken away? Did the state take him? Did well-meaning citizens whisk him away? To that end, that is still a bit of a mystery. Which takes us to, well, why do the Chinese do what they do? And this is the Chinese dynastic cycle. And in the Chinese historical lens, one important thread in Chinese history is that history is cyclical. And so they don't see history necessarily, and this is not to be universal, but we see history as a story of human progress, and this is a different take. And what this suggests is that you get a new dynasty, which would be the Chinese communists in 1948. Peace, rebuilding, protection, and then the inevitable vision is, of course, you get the emergence of corruption, you get the emergence of decay, you get the loss of the mandate of heaven, and then you have disaster repeat. So we tell the story of sort of the march of human progress, and that is not what this is. But it yields all kinds of unintended consequences, or I guess predictable consequences. This is Xi Jinping, who has essentially declared himself president for life. I think he's on his third 10-year term, if I recall correctly. So an anti-corruption, 100,000 people, Wikipedia asserts, have been accused of corruption. There's different schools of thought. Is this just a vehicle to purge political opposition? Is this a genuine attempt to deal with corruption? That, of course, is the Chinese, the Xi, President Peng certainly isn't saying. And that, of course, here we have China's Bill Gates, or China's Bezos. You might remember he just kind of evaporated for a while. So we have Elon Musk going on Saturday Night Live, and they have state security sequestering Jack Ma someplace. I think he has emerged. He did emerge for a little while, but he, of course, had attempted to use freedom of speech, for which the government security forces basically sequestered him away. And the message is, there can be no political dissent in China. You want to go ahead and get rich, you can try to get rich, although the state is very much cracking down on that. Then, of course, we have China leading the world in cameras and surveillance cameras. And we think about this utopian idea. What do you actually get when you do it? Why do we learn history? Well, we learn history to gain an understanding, and of course here we have the Uyghurs. The Nazis had the Jews, the Chinese are suppressing, of course, all dissent in the Uyghurs, and of course the Olympics are, is that next week? So countries are protesting. The United States is not sending government officials. So the rejection, the clear rejection of Western values and the implementation of a top-down vision. The Uyghurs, of course, are religious minorities in Western China, so certainly no tolerance. The religion needs to be the party. I'd be remiss to not mention, of course, the Gulag in Soviet Russia, which was both a practical answer to the question of how can we get people to work when there's not any profit motive or private property rights, or any good reason to, and that answer in socialist economies comes down to some form of coercion. This is Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago, which is arguably one of the most influential books in history. The notion that Solzhenitsyn asked himself, he was locked up in the Gulag, what can I do about this? What can I do about this terrible problem of the Soviet government? And so he wrote this book. And so this is an op-ed, the writer who destroyed an empire. So the notion of freedom of what do centralized, top-down authoritarian governments, because it always turns authoritarian, fear the most, and of course that is the light of truth and self-expression. So this is, in terms of other practical reasons, here we have life expectancy, and here we have the collapse of the Soviet Union and a 15-ish year period of collapsing life expectancy in post-Soviet Russia as a consequence. Oh, this didn't come out very well. This is the Chinese social scoring system. We have credit ratings here in the United States. They have a social scoring system which measures your acceptability as a citizen. And we understand that if we pay our bills on time and have a record of financial stability and earnings, that our credit rating goes up. Well, here in
Sorry. We have about 5 more minutes.
that wasn't the Chinese government.
No. I just have to go teach it.
So
Yeah.
your credit score, your social score determines your acceptability level to the government, and they understand incentives, so they can cut off your internet if you're posting things about the government doing undesirable things. They can deny your travel, they can deny college, they can keep you from getting on the train. So that notion of what a top-down society looks like, it's even scarier in the modern age, and not surprisingly, as a consequence, how worried am I about China? And the answer in the long term is not very, because the model consistently fails. Control is a chimera, as it were. So, not surprisingly, the birth rate is dramatically down, and I didn't get to, believe it or not, all these slides, I didn't get to the China and the one-child policy in terms of other national disasters. So that takes us then to one of the more recent editions of the Economist. Yes, this may be overseas and all the rest of this, how does this impact our daily lives here in the United States? And what the Economist is arguing is that the growth of the state is increasing, that they see a trend of increasing growth of the state, and maybe that starts with good purposes or for a good reason, but history inevitably teaches us that this is an undesirable outcome. And so there's a special section, they do sort of mini editions inside, and so their topics, industrial policy, is when the government decides what businesses are going to get support. Antitrust coming back, big tech, Google and Apple and Facebook, Meta, which isn't creepy at all. And government regulation and corporate taxes. So all of these things, of course, are on the table. And then I can finish with Jefferson, government coming from too much government, and of course the inevitable trend of government to get bigger. As a consequence, here we go. And otherwise, to finish up the practical perspective, what does Western civilization give us on top of all these other things? The answer is it works. So here we have global poverty, and what this is projecting, I think this is pre-COVID, which is going to skew things, is that global severe poverty will be pretty much absent from Asia by next decade. And child mortality. So the story of human progress, to finish with that, is these stories don't get reported. The miracles of progress, the miracles of innovation and all the rest, children need to learn these things. They need to see the story of progress as part of their education.